Uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco, cinco, seis.
The aim of a research program, my dear Hogan, is not to find out new information. We already know that the German pilots are superior. Here we are merely furnishing scientific proof.
The point of doing something nice for someone is not necessarily for personal gain. It can be a promotion, it can be something you meant well, it can be a huge time sink and a waste of money. Or at least that's what this one turned out to be. I'm Orion Archive, and we're picking back up on the Carnage playlist, however long ago later. And there's not really a good entry into this one other than to say that this was money that was probably would have been better spent someplace else. And so let's get into it. And, well, how did this come about? I mean, what's going on here? Now, if you haven't seen the previous Carnage videos, and it's a pretty long playlist, story kind of goes like this. Back in 2017, 2018, I started having problems with my graphics card at the time, which was a Radeon R9 290X from MSI. It was randomly cutting out, getting black screens, getting crashes to desktop, just a whole list of problems, and I wasn't sure how long it was going to last. And I made a few posts in various locations about something was going wrong here. And in this era, we're basically getting into the launch of the Radeon 6000 series, or at least they were on the horizon. The Radeon 5000 series, the first RDNA cards had been out, but there was only one card you could actually plausibly find in retail, and that was the 5700 or the 5700 XT, and volume wasn't that great. And this was starting to get into the uh, digital currency hijack when nation states started forcibly purchasing video game graphics cards from the manufacturers instead of putting those cards on retail market. And the cards that did wind up on retail market were digital currency mining equipment that had already been run into the ground and were discharged because they were running into capacitor issues, memory issues, various items, and you basically were buying a dead on arrival card for 3 or 4 times the actual MSRP, manufacturer suggested retail price point. And I was not anxious to replace a card I had bought for $300 with a card that cost $3,000 that wasn't necessarily any more powerful when it comes to actual gaming. And then we hit the COVID pandemic and things just completely went off the rails. So during the height of the pandemic, my graphics card was just getting more and more unstable, less and less able to do anything with it. A City of Heroes player managed to land at the launch of the RTX 3000 series, managed to land, I think, an RTX 3070 direct from a vendor at MSRP. They offered me their old RTX 2060. The one caveat being I had to move my R9 290X on to anyone else in the City of Heroes community who needed a graphics card. So back in November, some point, I think 2020, I think it was 2020, I made a post on one of the City of Heroes clone beta forums about my my R9 290X is available to anyone who wants it. And time went on, and there were no responses. Nobody was really needing a graphics card. Or at least they didn't want that graphics card. Of course, since I'd been slagging on it for a few years by this point, gee, whoop-de-doo, can't imagine why they wouldn't want it. So, I started kind of in the middle of the pandemic when all computer parts are starting to become very difficult to come by. And a thought just percolated in my head that, if somebody needs a new graphics card, they probably don't just need a new graphics card. They're probably also going to need an entire computer system. I mean, that seems like a reasonable assumption. And then at some point, I kind of got it into my head that I had enough spare parts and scrap laying around that I could probably put together a halfway decent computer and have it up and running so that if somebody in the City of Heroes community had a system crash out, they moved across the country without a computer, they suffered a house fire or something where they just lost something and they needed a computer to get back up. I wouldn't just be able to offer them a graphics card, I'd be able to offer them a whole system. Just throw it in the box, tell me where to ship it, off it goes. And so I put together basically my old media server, which in this case was a FX 6300 hex core processor. Now this is a bulldozer design, so there's lots of different things you can say about the instruction per clock cycle efficiency. But this is on a 970A G3.1 motherboard. Now, if you don't know what that means, this motherboard was one of the last motherboards released for Socket AM3. And this motherboard brought with it NVMe solid state drive support. This brought with it USB Type C port. This brought with it USB 3.1. So this is, all things considered, a fairly modern in terms of expected, um, what you would expect the features a modern computer to have. This actually has them. It has that solid state drive. It has that USB support. So it's not actually as old feature wise as its age would suggest. And that was actually one of the reasons why I had bought this particular motherboard, is it was one of the reasons why you would buy AMD hardware to begin with, is you would get more life out of the hardware compared to an Intel system. Now, anyways, moving onward, so I started putting this together and went through a cavalcade of problems that were documented in the Carnage series of videos. And uh, after getting permission to use a case, uh, my compulsive disorder obsessive, it cannot be obsessive compulsive disorder, that's out of order. My compulsive disorder obsessive kicked in, and I could not knowingly, willingly, if this was going to go out to another person, if this was going to go out to somewhere in the country and no idea where, I was not going to send something that had ports that could not be accessed. Like if the chassis had a USB Type C port on it, uh, that port had to be powered. Now, in the process of this, I was doing research into um, various add-in parts to add USB Type C front pin header. I think it's called a Type E connector, to add that to the system, and just kept running into some limitations. For example, one of the limitations in order to get the solid state drive to work is that on this particular motherboard, if you have a solid state drive in, the second PCI Express 16X slot is turned off. Now, what I don't know is if the other PCI X, the 1X slot below the first 16X slot, I don't know if that is also turned off. I don't know what's on or active or not active if you're using a solid state drive, because the system level bandwidth that will have gone to those expansion ports is instead directed to the solid state drive to, well, drive the solid state drive. I mean, it's kind of a fair, possibly a fair trade off. You get this new functionality, but you don't get the entire functionality of the system. So it's kind of just running into little headaches like these, figuring out ways around it, figuring out what I could add, and then the process kind of slowly evolved from there. It wasn't just I wanted to make a computer, I wanted to make a nice computer. I started wanting to make the best computer I possibly could make with what I had on hand. If someone was going to get this, they were going to get wireless, they were going to get Bluetooth, it was going to have that solid state drive, it was going to be fully feature complete compared to any other system that they could go out and buy. Only maybe only would cost them the shipping to get it wherever it's going, or people in the City of Heroes community might help in and chip in to help pay for the shipping to send us wherever. So that was the idea, and the longer that the computer just kind of sat here, the more I just started to add to it. Starting to add better fans. I went from an AMD Wraith general cooler to I think that's a uh, originally I wanted an ID cooling SEX something tower because those towers are offset and thus made sure that I could clear the memory with a normal size processor fan. It's one of the reasons why I couldn't fit in a Fantanks, I think it's a Fantanks cooler that I had on hand at the time. But the Fantanks actually turned out to be too large for for the chassis to case that they ultimately wound up with, and uh, socket compatibility kind of became an issue. I couldn't. Uh, Apparently, at some point, I had thrown away the required socket adapter for this particular heatsink for the fan tank. So not only was it too big for the chassis, I didn't actually have the proper mounting hardware, at least anymore, to mount it to this particular motherboard, and I wasn't going to be using the fan tanks on any other motherboard. Hmm. So it's still presently sitting in a box somewhere. Anyway, so I wound up with after purchasing an ID Cooling XE uh, tower fan, discovered that it doesn't actually ship with AM3 mounting hardware. It only ships with AM4 and AM5 and Intel mounting hardware. Okay, okay, nice to know. Would have been, I thought it was an AM3 compatible heatsink when I bought it, so wound up with and then we started to get into another aspect of this where I had wound up with a white case, and I had wound up with something else, more components that were white colored, and I kind of wanted to complete look, a white heatsink. And Vitru had a tower heatsink that looked like it would fit, would have memory clearance. But since I wasn't sure, there was something else that I had been playing around with, and that was ID Cooling's slim 120 millimeter fans. Now, for years, you've probably know that is it Noctua? I think it's Noctua. Uh, it's either Noctua or I can just go look at the box. Um, There's another vendor that specifically makes slimline fans. Okay, yes, it's Noctua. Make as I grab the actual box. Yeah, Noctua makes slimline fans, but they tend to be expensive. They're good, but they're really expensive. And I wasn't really quite willing to just dump that kind of money. ID Cooling made slimline fans that were roughly half the price of the Noctuas, so I bought a couple. And originally I was very impressed with them. They were relatively silent. Uh, yeah, there is a performance difference between the ID Coolings and the Noctuas. Then you'd kind of probably expect that from the price point just alone. But it wasn't a big enough difference to justify not buying the ID cooling. So I started picking up some more of these slimline ID cooling fans to finish putting the case together. And at first, my plan was I was looking for the slimline fans for a different case, for an older Nanoxia case. Now, the Nanoxia case is actually left. I no longer have it. Because while I was, and we're getting into more of the backstory here, where uh, the first chassis that I had personally bought for myself to move my primary computer into uh, was a B quad. Well, let's back up. I was using a um, Silverstone SG. Well, I had a Silverstone SG09, and then I bought a Silverstone SG10. Now, these are quite older small form factor chassis. And I really love small form factor systems because you can pretty much put them anywhere that you want to. They don't look like a traditional computer. They don't take up a massive amount of space. I love micro ATX builds. I love mini ITX builds. I love just having this flexibility to have a fully functional, powerful computer, but not have to dedicate a significant amount of real estate to have that computer. And for the era that I bought it in, I really loved the Silverstone SG09 and the SG10. However, flash forward to modern day, in trying to wire these things up, to get wires where I needed them to go, to replace fans, to do just filter maintenance, these turn into absolute nightmares to deal with, to work with. And in the process of this, I started had looking up alternatives to the Silverstone. And there's a brand called Noxia, and Noxia had a series of chassis called Deep Silence. Now, these Noxia chassis shipped with foam padding or a foam-ish padding that deadened noise from inside the chassis. The Noxia shipped with rubber grommets on every single hole so that wherever you ran cables through, there was a noise deadening, sound deadening component to the cables moving. So the Noxia cases, I absolutely adored them because they made a very loud and obnoxious computer. Not so loud, not so obnoxious, and you could have an Anoxia case sitting right next to you, turned on, going full blast, and it would be, well, several decibels quieter than other chassis at the time. But because Anoxia is located in California, which is run by the most incompetent governor in the United States as it stands right now, I realize some would argue that it's the most corrupt governor in the United States right now. Um, Nanoxia had to shut down operations because of the pandemic. You would not be able to get or lay hands on a Nanoxia case because of the governor of California and the lockdown restrictions. And so someone wanted me to build them a computer. Someone in the City of Heroes community approached me. They want me to build them a custom computer. It's, they knew I'm, not having the best of time. They knew I was having medical problems. They knew some of the backstory that I just don't talk about anywhere else. And they wanted me to build them a computer to give me something to do. And so I started doing the research on, well, what chassis would I use? I can't lay hands on the Anoxias. And there was a brand called Be Quiet that was highly rated. So for their chassis, got them a Dark Base 700. And I absolutely loved working with that case. Compared to all of the cases that I'd worked with before, the Dark Base was just such a joy to operate with. And this is where I first ran into it's got a Type C port on the front that is not a standard USB 3.1 header. What the heck is this? How do I plug this up? And that's when run into, okay, you need a Type E header. There's not exactly a whole lot of PCI Express Type E headers on the market. There's a few conversions available, but almost every single one of the conversion adapters has a warning about the wattage that can be pumped through this system. Well, that's not good. And when you get right down to it, if you have a USB Type-C port on the front of a system chassis, there is kind of an expectation that it's going to be a full-featured USB Type-C port, including being able to deliver all the power that a Type-C port can deliver, the USB power delivery. And not having that just felt tacky. So finding a motherboard that has a native Type-E port, that resulted in a whole other kerfuffle in and of itself. And so now I've had a better idea of what hardware I was looking at, what keywords I needed to be looking at. And then, after this computer had been finished built, I got a Dark Base 700 for myself. I spent my own money on it because I like this chassis so much. The maintenance on it was easy, cleaning out the filters, where the lines would run. It was an absolute joy to work with. Flash forward to what I was calling the giveaway computer, and at first I was starting with Be Quiet's budget chassis, the 500 series. Now, there is a stark price difference between Be Quiet's 500 series and Be Quiet's Dark Base 700 series. And almost everything that made the Dark Base 700 so easy to work with was just missing in the lower spec chassis. I absolutely hated working with it. Uh, and when it got wound up being used a for a different support request, I was kind of glad that not have to work with that case again. But I knew for the giveaway computer, since I wasn't going to be putting it in the Be Quiet budget chassis, I went looking for another budget chassis, and at this point I'd kind of already settled on I really wanted a white chassis for some reason because I did like uh, how the Be Quiet white chassis had looked, how it looked when I'd had some of this hardware in there. All right. Um, So going looking around, and there's another brand highly rated called Fractal Design. I've never used a Fractal Design chassis before. And so I picked up a Fractal Design G50. I'm not sure what the actual spec model is, in white. And originally, I was looking at maybe since I was doing all of this hardware switching around, I was going to um, move my media server out of an Anoxia chassis and into a more modern server. And at first, I was going to get a Fractal Design. Then I contacted Fractal Design's customer service, and the response was enough that. And this was kind of predicated on I had seen the difference between the budget Be Quiet and the high end Be Quiet. A massive gap in the high end is totally worth the extra money that's being charged because of everything it has that the budget version does not have. And I kind of assume, okay, it's going to be like this for the Fractal Design. I've got a budget Fractal Design. I'll go for a higher end model since, okay, this is kind of a pain to work with. Well, it's still less of a pain than other chassis in the past, but still not the best to work with. We'll give a higher end Fractal Design. And when I sent them a support request over a question about color matching and what could be shipped with, the response I got was so customer hostile, I decided I wasn't going to deal with Fractal Design again. Period. They weren't worth it. So I started looking around for options. And in one of the spending more money, and this is going to be something that will come on camera later, I wound up with a different vendor who made a chassis that I absolutely love, but some of the features it has require expensive add-ons that aren't aren't as robust as they probably should be. And like I said, this is really a topic for a different video since we're staying on the topic of I'm trying to stay on the topic of the giveaway computer or what I've been calling the giveaway computer. So the giveaway computer wound up in a Pacto Design G, I think this is a G50. And for a budget case, it's not the worst option. Now I just finished working with another budget case. One moment. Or at least semi budget case. It's still more expensive than the Fractal. It's less expensive than the full Be Quiet tower, and it's way less expensive than the other tower that I'm now sitting on. Uh, but it was so much easier to work with, and in stark contrast between the budget entries and various vendors here, I started to run into various problems with the Fractal Design. And this started taking up more and more time because it's sitting here. Nobody's responded to the forum post. Nobody's. I let the game moderators know that I had a giveaway computer. If they knew of somebody in the City of Heroes community who had suffered tragically. They needed a compute. They needed a computer. I had one ready to go. It's just sitting here. No one's asking for it. Okay, admittedly, it's at least by this point now 14-year-old hardware in some aspects. Started coming across other things, other aspects. And one of those was now that the R9 290X was outside of the chassis I had it in, I noticed that when the fans got going, when pushing a 3D load, some of the fans were noisy, noisier than they should have been. I mean, it's always been loud, but this was definitely more high pitched, sounding more like a bearing or a bushing failure. So I bought replacement fans. I took the fans out, matched the model number that was printed on them, and bought replacement fans. Replacement fans that came in, when I put them in, they worked, but they had a very smoky smell to them, which kind of worried me. So I went back to search and looked for a replacement fan that would be compatible, and I wound up with fans that they are MSI fans. They do have an ODM manufacturer model, but I believe they are for an RTX twin Frozer system. Or maybe they are not for this graphic card. First of all, they have a curvature to them. They have more blades. They are relatively more silent at full speed operation, at least in comparison to my memory and discarding the bearing sound or the bushing sound, and they move a substantial amount more air. So it's upgrade on the fans for cooling the R9 290X. Now, another bit of metadata in all of this is that at some point, and this is what had predicated the change in hardware and where I'm shifting cases completely, in that my power supply on my primary computer had just died up and blew out. And this now brought to light the possibility that maybe it wasn't my graphics card dying. Maybe it was my uh, power supply that was really fritzing out, and I no longer had the tools or capability to test the power supply to see whether or not that was the problem. So, in a completely new power supply, the R9290X was running flawlessly. Once I replaced the fans, it was running flawlessly. I added something else. Something else that I noticed when I took the R9290X out of the Silverstone and put it in a different chassis is the R9290X had picked up quite a bit of sag. So I picked up from the EZDYI an anti-sag bar, which had its own ARGB lighting, and uh, this straightened up the R9290X, and again, this helped with the fans, so now the fans are not bent, which may have contributed to fan failure or the possibility of a fan not operating properly. And so now this particular graphic card, every time that I put it through a stress test, is functioning flawlessly. There are no rendering problems, there's no crashes, there's no bugs whatsoever. As far as I can tell, performance wise, it's performing exactly the same, if not better, than it performed when I first got it, if only due to the change in fans that are actually now cooling it, which do have a significant amount more airflow for the volume space of the fans. And that's kind of a critical point. Uh, so now we've kind of had this. I've gone from putting together a scrap computer to putting together a really nice computer, and then I couldn't leave it at that. I started adding more things, and since I really didn't know where this computer was going to end up, if it ended up in some place like Utah or Ohio or California or Nevada, or it could wind up in the Rocky Mountains, or it could wind up in the south coast of Florida. I just no idea where this system was going to wind up at, assuming somebody ever did need it. I was going to make sure that no matter the conditions, it was going to be properly cooled. So I went from having a single fan on the processor to having a dual fan tower. And I went from having just the base fans that it came with to fans at the top as well to ensure the maximum amount of airflow possible through this chassis. Now, this is where again things started to go a little bit off the rails, because originally I was going to use the Silverstone fans from the Silverstone SG10. However, after placing them in the chassis and then testing the airflow, which I could do, the Silverstone fans were junk. I mean, just yes, I went through. I cleaned the blades off and made sure that the blades were as clean as they possibly could be. No dust buildup, no problems. The amount of airflow compared to other fans that I had available to compare against was atrocious. Almost no air movement at all. And I know some people are going to argue there's a difference between static pressure, there's a difference between cubic airflow, different fans can be optimized for different purposes. But when it came right down to it, the Silverstone fans did not move air like I thought they would. Now, they're supposed to be quiet, and yes, they're very quiet. But if they're very quiet and they're not moving any air at all, they're not really useful. Well, now we have a plausibility for maybe why the power supply failed over. My Silverstone chassis wasn't moving the air that I thought it was capable of moving. So I started, my original plan was to use ID cooling fans. I was going to use the thin line, the slimline fans that I liked. And since I was using the slimline fans, I decided to give the larger fans a try from ID cooling since, let's see how those perform. Now, in terms of, let's call it air movement per noise, how much noise they make versus how what the RPMs are. And this is something where I can't actually bring up the fan monitors because there's another factor in this particular system that we'll get to because of this. The the fans that I was using, the ID coolings outperformed the other fans that I had collected over the years that I pulled out of chassis. They outperformed the Nanoxias, they outperformed the Silverstones. They got very, very close to the Noctuas that I had purchased for my media server. Very close. And I'm talking within 95% of the performance and noise envelope for still half the cost of a Noctua. Now, if you're on a budget, this is astounding value per money that you're getting over 90% of the performance for half the cost. And while I was doing all of this, one of the things I'd wanted to test was I was also taking dips into liquid cooling. I had picked up an all-in-one cooler from Intermax, and at first I had tried because I was still trying to use this again. We're now on a different project. I'm now talking about what's going to be the Intel computer, separate computer. The Intel computer is an old i7-920 that I was going to try liquid cooling on, and I started with an Intermax all-in-one because it was inexpensive. And the Intermax all-in-one would not fit, or at least it would not fit with its default fan in the chassis with the Nanoxia that I had. It's just too big. But a slimline fan, the Noctuas, would fit. Or at least they would fit for the application that I was trying to use the Intermax in. So I tried the ID cooling fans instead of the Noctuas. And they worked. The Intel system worked flawlessly using the slimline ID cooling fans instead of the default fan that the Intermax had shipped with. Well, knowing this, I decided, well, I'm using a tower air cooler. Can I use the slimline ID cooling fans on a tower air cooler and get good enough performance? I'm not going to get identical performance, but if I have a slimline fan on each side of a tower cooler, I should get better cooling performance in theory than simply uh, having a single full depth fan, which may or may not fit depending on where the memory is at or how big the memory is or the heat sink that the memory has. The slimline fans will definitely fit. A standard width fan may not fit. So I at first tried the ID cooling fans, two slimlines on either side of the V-True tower. The reason I moved away from that is because the slimline fans have rubber. I would call them rubber grommets. I'm not sure that's the quite correct word on the end. And the mounting pins or the mounting brackets to hold the fans to the heatsink, they didn't they were not quite happy gripping and holding on to the ID cooling fans enough that I was more worried about the brackets coming off and the fans falling down, and now we've lost complete cooling. So the ID cooling fans did work. I was just nervous about, especially if, again, if I'm shipping this across the country, and this system takes a hard knock, this could come loose, and now we've got a fan hanging down that whoever gets this now have to put back on, and because it's generally placed to begin with, this could be a big problem. No, it could be a little problem for some people. So I decided to go back and try the larger fans and the ID cooling. Larger fans, well, they actually did fit in the space that I had on the V-True heatsink with in that position. And also while I was doing this, I decided I would move the ID cooling thin line fans to the top of the chassis. And the reason I did that is that now in this chassis there is room to get in and work with the cables at the top of the motherboard. So if you're trying to arrange the CPU fan cable, if you're trying to arrange the or get to the power connector for the motherboard, putting in the slimline fans freed up enough space that now you can do these tasks, or you could replace the fans on the processor heatsink without repeatedly banging your knuckles and having to take the top fans out before you can do anything else at the top end of the motherboard. It also made getting to the memory much easier. Again, big fans in there, you're going to be knocking your knuckles trying to take memory in and out or replace memory. Now, to be fair, this is DDR3 memory. You're probably not going to be replacing it because DDR3 memory supplies are drying up. And you'll pay is again, this is one of those probably not worth it to add more memory. Or at least not financially worth it. And so that kind of brings us up to where we are, where we were a few months ago. And then I had done a full power on, power up. And one of the aspects that had come up during this time is that almost all of the fans I was using now were 4-pin controlled fans. And now this means that they have uh, a power management feedback. The motherboard that I was using did not have most of the pins on the motherboard for fans, and it has a lot of fan headers are only 3 pins, which means I'm missing out on some of the power management features for the fans. This also meant that turning this on at full tilt meant it was obnoxiously loud. I just mind-numbingly, mind-blowingly, obnoxiously loud. So I decided I needed a third-party fan controller. Now I was very happy with the EasyDYI anti-sag bar. And EasyDYI makes a fan controller or makes a fan controller hub. So I got one. It was inexpensive. And then I found out after buying it and getting it in and trying it that the EasyDYI relied heavily on using the power management capabilities of the motherboard. And there's only one 4-pin header on this motherboard, and that's the processor fan. That's it. All the others are 3-pin. So, in order to drive all the fans in the system using the EasyDYI fan hub, I would have to use the processor fan controls. Now, for a system this old, using the processor fan controls to drive all of the other fans is not elegant. I was not happy with how it worked because now I had no direct control over a processor fan directly responding to rises in temperature on the tower itself, and well, I wasn't really happy with that. So I wanted to do something about that. And my decision to do something about that was I was going to spend more money. And in this case, I decided since I was spending the money, I was going to do something else. All of the fans that I had wound up purchasing all had ARGB capability. The anti-sag bar that I had bought had ARGB compatibility. I had a bunch of potential lighting in the system, and the motherboard does not support ARGB. I think there's a header for the older style non-addressable lighting system, but the addressable lighting system wasn't supported. And one of the things that you can get ARGB controllers for not that much money, but most of these are click-in remotes or inline remotes. So if you want to change your lights or pattern, you've got to open the case up and hit a button inside the case, or you're going to have a remote outside and it's you're still stuck with a little bit of patterns. But there is a vendor who does make an ARGB controller that can be controlled over Universal Serial Bus, a USB controller that can be put internal to a system. And while their Linux support is abysmal to the point of being non-existent, there is an open source project to support this vendor, and the controller that this vendor makes to control ARGB over Universal Serial Bus is supported and can work under Linux. So I did have an option for a Universal Serial Bus controller that would be internal to the system, that a user can theoretically control the lighting from the desktop, and that would be Razer, the Razer Chroma addressable RGB controller. Now, Razer also makes a USB controllable fan controller, again, internal to the system. Now, going over the Open Razer project, it seems that this fan controller can also be addressed through the same utilities that power the ARGB Chroma adapter. Well, now, seems like I have a pretty good solution here. So I spent the money. Or let me back up a second here. Before I spent the money on an ARGB controller for the giveaway computer, I had bought a Razer Chroma adapter for myself, and I was going to test it and make sure it did exactly what I thought it did. So I wasn't buying hardware for someone else that I had no idea whether or not this is going to work or not. And the Open Razer project says that it's compatible across a number of distributions. Well, the only distribution that I've actually gotten it to work on flawlessly, first time, first shot, has been Ubuntu based projects. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. But that's what then purchased. Once I knew for a fact I could get this to work, it's working on my own system, I can replicate this, I can duplicate it. It's probably worth the purchase price to do what I want it to do. So the giveaway computer wound up with both a Razer fan controller and a Razer uh, Chroma addressable controller. And while installing these, I came across the reasons why I would never buy a fractal design case like this again. And again, I'm comparing this case to another budget case that I just finished working with specifically for the Intel system. And in that other budget case, there were plenty of places to tie wires off. There were plenty of places for me to run wires through. I had absolutely no difficulty. In this other budget case, running wires was just as easy as in the Be Quiet case and the other big, massive, expensive tower that I haven't named yet. The fractal design has almost no cable tie points anywhere in the case. There's a handful of them. So running wires, and one of the things I wanted to do, I didn't just want this to be a computer someone was getting. I wanted this to be the best computer I could put together with what I had on hand. And the backside of the computer behind the motherboard is a friggin' mess. Because in order to get these controllers to work, in order to get uh, the wiring to work, in order to get everything in the back so that the front of the case is clear, so it looks all pretty and nice, the backside is a mess of cables that are tied together on no mounting points whatsoever. I am completely embarrassed as to how the cable management is run. And one of the other things that I was doing at this time is I had picked up some serial ATA cables and already populated ports so that if you wanted to put in DVD drives or hard drives at the top or you wanted to use the bays at the bottom, you already had serial ATA cables and power cables run to those locations. So all you had to do was just plug in your hardware, plug up the wires, and there you go. Getting these cables to stay where they wanted to stay was a freaking nightmare. The fractal design, this is so badly designed. I would never recommend this case to anyone. Even if you're on a budget, pick something else. I don't have a specific case in mind at this specific price point. Just save, like I said, the other budget case, I'm using budget quotes here, is still less expensive than other options, but it's still compared to this, just, it's worth that extra money. It really is. Um, so I was, so finishing putting this together, and then we get up to the big bugbear point where I'm at, or the last thing that I worked on before putting this together and starting this recording. And that is, I discovered there was another problem with this motherboard because it had support for solid state drives and USB 3.1 with a Type C port on the back. It had given up lanes, the internal processor lanes that are used to drive other USB ports. So the internal USB ports, there's only two headers. Oh, and well, okay, there's two USB 2.0 headers and only one USB 3 header. Okay, having only one USB 3 header, not exactly unusual, but having only two USB 2.0 headers is kind of unusual for most of the motherboards that I've worked with. Even low end motherboards normally have at least three. So this sent me spinning off looking for in order to make the razors work, I needed to add more USB ports. Okay, do I do this through a PCI card? Uh, and how do I fit a PCI card in here? Because of the anti-sag bar, what were my options? And while I'm doing all the searching, I came across a brand called NLabs. NLabs makes a breakout header that adds four ports or four USB 2.0 ports for a single USB 2.0 motherboard header. Now the NLabs, it's not pretty. It's open exposed circuitry. It's open exposed ports. It's no worse than the open exposed circuitry on the motherboard itself. So you're not probably going to get shocked if you touch this while it's in use. But it doesn't look pretty. It looks kind of obnoxious. It's not making the case look. It's not an easy way to hide wires, and then putting this uh, adapter in and then finding a place to mount it, I kept running into more problems. Is where I was going to put the Razer Chroma controller in one of the hard drive chassis. But if you mount the Razer controller in a hard drive chassis, there's no effective way to run wires in there unless somebody makes a 90-degree angle uh, ARGB header adapter. And no, I didn't go looking for one. The Razer fan controller has a magnetic base, so at least as long as you have something that's magnetic, you can attach the Razer fan controller to it. But the ARGB controller only ships with some 2.5-inch hard drive mounting holes and tape. So what I wound up doing was just setting the fan controller on top of the hard drive controller bays, gluing the uh, ARGB controller to the fan controller using the self-applied sticky tape, and then stacking the USB breakout boards on top of the fan controller using its shipped with uh, foam sticky tape pads. So now on the one side of this computer, I've got an entirely unstable hunk of plastic and wires just going everywhere, and I'm not sure how I'm going to secure that for shipping. I may just take a few cable creation tie wraps or Velcro straps and just strap the whole thing down. But that's a bridge I'll cross if when I get to it. So that's kind of the story on the hardware that went in there, and some of the hoops that I had to jump through, some of the things I'm not going to do again. And now we're really at a point where, well, let's do something with this. Now, what I want to do right now is we're going to change our boot options here, and we're going to change, we'll go with that. And now we'll let this boot up and we'll see what we got to work with. And we're at 50 minutes in. 50 minutes of me just talking about hardware before I actually do anything. I'm actually impressed that my uh voice has held out this long. Now I'm assuming that it booted from the USB stick. Well, we'll find out in a second. Okay, we've got a, what's that, a reboot? No. Should I have set UFI boot first? Maybe. I'm not sure if we've locked up or no, I've got a mouse. It is. Okay. I've got something. Alright, yes, we actually do have. We are running from the USB stick. And we'll just. Alright. I'm going to have to go plug in a cable. Somehow I just knew that was going to happen. Okay. Here, little cable. Where are you? There you are. Alright. Cable in. Alright. Set back in. Okay, I don't think I knocked the camera out of position. Alright. Let's restart with it connected to the internet. And okay. As you can see, I've already had a distribution installed on this. We can also see a little bit more about the hardware that's actually in here. In this case, we are using a PNY terabyte solid state drive. Now, CS1030, I think this is a PCI 3.0 NVMe drive, but I'm not entirely certain about that, and I'm not sure it matters given the motherboard itself. It's still a solid state drive. It's just not necessarily. All right, and we will. Yeah, see what you're set on. You're set. We got that. BIOS grub, swap, and our home folder. Let's check our sizes. Okay, we got 40 gigs for the OS, and we've got 870 gigs about. I'm debating whether or not I want to give more space to the operating system itself at this point. We want to do format, and we're going to take this down to 850. Yeah, trying to do gentle movements with the mouse. Actually, here's how we'll do this. Oh, all right. What's that give us? That actually took us to 840. So we'll do 87. Okay. We'll move that over. Format. All right. So now we have about 65 gigs to play with on the root drive, 850 gigs on the home drive. And I'm not sure why we got this free space on the end, but we're just going to. Will it let me take this out? And speed this up a bit. Because I'm not really sure how much space is actually there to work with. Let's let this roll all the way up. Did it actually tell me anything on the mouse over it? No. What happens if I try to overset it? Okay, it looks to be at its maximum. Alright, we still, for some reason, have a few bytes left on the end, but we'll let that go. We're at 850 gigs. Alright, we're set on our storage device. Next. Uh, Needs to be at least 3. Alright, well, edit. And we'll go with alright, we need a FAT32. And we need a boot EFI. Okay, I need to have the boot flag set for you. Okay. Now, what shall we name our prospective user? Present. No. Let's go with treasure. Alright, now we'll do install, and I will just let this go. Yeah, an hour into the video before anything actually starts. And because it did the file partitioning, this may take longer than I thought it would. And we're into the unpacking. And now not much going on. Man, I'd kick in the music that I'm listening to, but then something will happen. I know, I'm proper presentation. You're supposed to be talking, and probably should have saved some of the computer talk. Would have gone into it for the installation, but oh well. Alright, package removal. Yeah, I'm just letting my voice rest for a minute. All done. Restart now. Let's flop that camera off for a second and go grab that drive. Alright, camera back. Reboot. And we are up. Alright. We're at an hour and 8 minutes. So I'm going to cut this video off now, and we'll work on the installing the OpenRazor controllers in a different video. If you've hung around this long, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.